Hello, I'm Barry Duncan. I'd like to talk to you about the 4 secrets of PCOMS implementation. Also like to call your attention to the new PCOMS manual, your all-in-one source for everything PCOMS. But before that, I'd like to introduce you to Better Outcomes Now, or BOND. We are a practice-driven training and research consortium that focuses on improving outcomes via implementation of PCOMS. BOND is distinguished by our responsibility for the scientific credibility of PCOMS, as well as our dedication to consumer privilege and social justice. Our website, www.betteroutcomesnow.com, is a home of over 250 resources about PCOMS, including PCOMS implementation, PCOMS e-learning with many webinars about how-tos about PCOMS as well as the common factors, the science of PCOMS, and of course the PCOMS measures themselves in 28 languages. Finally, there is the web application of PCOMS, which combines science, technology, and clinical expertise to make a difference in consumer outcomes. Better Outcomes Now is the web application of PCOMS, a true application of its clinical process and intent. So I'm going to talk to you about the 4 secrets. This is kind of what I've learned from the school of hard knocks, that if these things aren't in place, the implementation isn't really going to pass muster, because even though there are only 4-item scales, there's a lot more to it than just flicking those forms. It's really paradoxical if you look at the brevity of these 2 forms, 2 4-item scales, but then when you try to implement it at agency level, it gets a lot more complicated. So these are the things I've learned over the years that kind of set people up for success. So I'm going to go through each one of them in tandem. In it for the long haul, love your data, inspire the frontline clinician, and supervision for a change. First, some general comments. Change is hard. Staff need structure and support to make it happen. And if you're a frontline person, it's always something. Life can be very tough, and they're skeptical. It's been 5 days since the last paradigm shift, and 5 more days there'll be another one. That's kind of the way they look at these things. They just hunker down, it'll blow over, and we'll be on to something else. But this time we have to let them know that this is different. This is a different process. And people are skeptical and afraid of change. All these things will come up. People have all kinds of concerns about implementing PCOMS. And one of the main things is that management will use the results against them. And so people have a variety of different responses. You got to deal with these things forthrightly and transparently.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
That's right. Some people will even respond with anger. But, you got to let people know that it's going to be required, but will not be used in any punitive way. The purpose is to partner with consumers to raise the quality of service and prove the value of our service in a way that makes clinical sense. That's the whole idea, to raise the bar of the quality of our services to our clients. So, in it for the long haul. I know it's an overused metaphor, but it is a marathon, not a sprint. No doubt about that. Here's the PCOMS implementation readiness checklist. Good idea to go through this. I'm going to hit the highlights of it, but it's on the website. If you go to training, hit PCOMS implementation, there this will be, and you can download it for you to go over and think about implementation. But let me hit the high points. First of all, you got to have consensus among senior managers. You can't have an important person within your organization that's not on board, or everybody under that person will also not be on board. You got to have a business and financial plan that incorporates PCOMS. When you compare it to other evidence-based practices, it's really very inexpensive, but that doesn't mean it's cheap. It doesn't mean that it doesn't cost anything. So you got to have a business financial plan for training, for hardware, for software, all those kinds of things you need to get in your budget and forecast over the coming years. You need to think about having a core group of internal PCOMS trainers. You don't want to rely on outside consultants forever. This might include sending a group of folks to the Train the Trainers that I do every year in South Florida, but nevertheless, getting these people within your agency to be the go-to people and kind of wean yourself off outside consultants. One of the very important aspects of PCOMS is collection of data and analysis of the data. So you got to start thinking about the infrastructure it will require to make that happen. And of course, the most important thing, perhaps, is that you have a supervisory infrastructure that uses the data to identify at-risk clients and proactively address the needs and improve therapist performance along the way. This is a quality improvement strategy at the individual therapist level, at the agency level, but that all happens via supervision, which I will talk about in more detail in a little bit. The second secret of success is you gotta love your data. And I don't mean having a casual friendship. I mean you got to love your data, much more than just a friend. And you got to get everybody on board in your agency to start thinking about the data in ways that it can improve their practice, improve their outcomes. I used to think that this would happen organically. What was I thinking? You know, people are not going to come to this on their own because many mental health professionals, substance abuse professionals really aren't that keen on data. So it's kind of a new learning to embrace data and use it for all its purposes. But it allows you to know during the implementation process who's doing it and whether they're doing it correctly. We'll talk about that. You'll know whether or not people are doing this with integrity so that PCOMS can do its vital purpose of identifying those consumers who aren't benefiting. So you start however you can. If you have to do it in Excel, there are Excel spreadsheets that you can put ORS scores in here. You can calculate effect sizes, average change, reliable change, all that stuff you can do. But you got to think about the whole feasibility aspect. The easier you can make this for the clinicians, the more likely that they will actually implement this. And Excel works. I did Excel for many years before there were software systems to do this stuff for me. And it worked, but it does add a feasibility issue. It's not as feasible, obviously, as other ways, but of course that's a budget item as well. If you have an electronic system like Better Outcomes Now, it administers the measures for you. Clinicians don't have to pull out the ruler or add anything up. It automatically collects the data, sorts the data, analyzes the data. All of those things are done for the clinician and results in this list of clients so that you know whether or not your caseload is on track or not on track. And you can look right down through here and see the clients who are in the red here. Those would be the ones that you'd want to make sure that you talked about in supervision or you thought about before you went into the next meeting with them. Electronic data systems allow you to do that. Better Outcomes Now is built with these kind of purposes in mind, both to help the everyday clinician do PCOMS and to help the supervisory and agency process of implementation. The third secret is you got to inspire the frontline clinician. We got some really good things going for us here, and that is that therapists do the work because they want to make a difference. They want to improve over time. They need to grow to avoid burnout. These are the findings of a huge study, a huge longitudinal study about therapists over 20 years, 14,000 therapists at this point. And it looks at how therapists think about their own work. And these are the things that they glean from that study. These are all things we have going for us in terms of implementing PCOMS. Because let's face it, being a frontline clinician is a tough job. Sometimes it's the worst job on earth. At least it feels that way. Maybe worse than draining septic tanks or putting tar on a roof in Miami in August. Or maybe even being worse than being the new crew member who just beamed down to a hostile planet with Kirk, Bones, and Spocks. You know he ain't coming back. But then you're also the media depictions of us. They cast us as kooks and crackpots, and we're blamed for creating a nation of wimps or otherwise causing the decline of Western civilization with all our encouragement of self-indulgence and preoccupation with feelings, and our daily affirmations a la Stuart Smiley.
Because I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
So the media doesn't like us too much. And then, of course, there is the economic situation. You know, this job doesn't pay that much, and the typical agency therapist faces many hardships, sometimes seemingly unattainable productivity, instrumental paperwork, funder oversight, and then more lately, threats of layoff. And that doesn't even speak to the emotional downside of the work itself, the sometimes overwhelming tragedy of the human condition that at times is kind of tough to shake at the end of the day. But we don't do this work because we thought we would acquire the lifestyles of the rich and famous, and we knew at the outset that mixing it up with the morass of human suffering would not be a walk in the park. That smart, creative individuals make the sacrifices only to earn far less than others with the same degrees says something. It only makes sense because being a therapist is a calling. It's not just a way to make a living. And this study says we want to make a difference, we want to grow, and actually we need to grow to ward off the grim reaper of burnout. The secondary trauma stuff, many people think that's what burnout is about, but these researchers found that feeling stagnant, not growing, not apart, not able to maintain a viable connection to our clients, those things burn us out far more quickly. I just want to help people. So that's number 3. And then the final one is the most important one, and that is we have to have a supervisory infrastructure that uses the data to give feedback to frontline clinicians to talk about those clients who aren't benefiting so we can turn that client around in the very next session. Unless we use PCOMS to identify clients who aren't benefiting and then actually do something about it, it's not worth the time, effort, and money to even try to implement it. So how are you going to get people to do this? Is the evidence the 5 RCTs? Maybe. Because you're telling them to? Maybe. Maybe they're devoted to consumer privilege. I hope so. Maybe they're open to new ideas. I hope so there too. The older the clinician, the less likely. So no offense to you older clinicians out there. But these things will get some people on board, but not everybody on board. In fact, here's therapists' reaction to PCOMS. That's right. They don't take to it like a duck to water. In fact, only a quarter to a third of people will say, hey, this is a good idea. I'm going to do it with my next client and just rock and roll from there. Most people have to experience it first that it could be helpful to them, and that's going to occur via the process of supervision. But again, the paradox about PCOMS is until you do it correctly, that is, until you do it to where you get data integrity, you'll never realize the benefit. And that's where supervision comes in. And in fact, that's the first order of business of supervision, is to ensure data integrity, to look at all the first session scores, to look over the graphs, to make sure that there is data integrity. Of course, it's much easier not to hold people accountable, right? It's much easier to do supportive supervision, and there's nothing wrong with supportive supervision, but it can't be all that we do. Just like with our clients, it's very good to be supportive of our clients, but that's not all we do when we're in the room with them. So holding people accountable for data integrity is a very important part of this process. So you have to sometimes question and challenge in a respectful way, of course. Sometimes you have to put people on the spot, but if you want your data to have integrity so it identifies the at-risk clients, this is what you have to do. And here are the data integrity markers. 30% of intakes over the cutoff, well, probably means that unless you have a mandated population, of course, then you're going to have a lot of intakes over the cutoff. But if you have a regular outpatient load, going to be 30% or below, and it usually means people aren't introducing the ORS very well so that clients understand what it's about and that it represents their distress level in their life. ORS scores between 32 and 40 are rarely a valid intake score. It doesn't make much sense. If you're doing that well, why are you talking to a therapist? It usually means the therapist isn't matching up the client's presentation and reasons for service to how the client's rating the ORS. And then finally, when ORS scores look like a saw, like a sawtooth, it means that they're going up and down, up and down. The client's generally using the ORS as an emotional thermometer and not really relating it to the reasons for service. Here in Better Outcomes Now, it identifies all these validity things for you. And you can see there the filter says, above the clinical cutoff, above 32, saw-tooth pattern, all these things you can glean right from the radar list so that you can talk to the therapist about that so that you can make sure that they're using the PCOMS with integrity and getting good data validity. And of course, on the stats page, it's also going to do a running count of those things for you. Your excluded raters, we don't put those in the database because we know they're not valid scores and it would just muck up the data. There's also something else you can use that can help you with, and that's the adherence scale. And this is kind of a self-administered scale of how you're doing the 10 aspects, the 10 competencies, the 10 skills. Keep in mind that these aren't skills that clinicians don't already have, but they are specifically related to PCOMS. So it's a way for people to get a check on all these things and for supervisors to talk to clinicians about how their data has integrity and whether or not they're doing the skills of PCOMS. The next thing, and this is really where you spend most of your time, once you have data integrity, then you can actually do PCOMS supervision, where you're talking about those clients who have been identified as not benefiting and talking about them in ways that formulate a plan in the next session. Here again, we can see in this particular shot of clients or raters that this client is not doing so well, this client's not doing so well. Those would be people we would target in supervision to formulate a plan in the next session. And there's a list of questions that I like to do in supervision. What's the client say? Is the client engaged? What have we done so far? What can we do differently now? Are there any other resources we can rally to get this client on track? And then finally, is it time to move the client on to a different provider of service, or what I like to say, fail successfully? Once we do that, we are forming plans. Supervision is a very proactive process of formulating a plan for the next session to do something differently. We can now review the stats and discuss ways for the therapist to improve and, of course, encourage action. So we're very open about this. We want people to embrace their numbers and understand them. There's nothing about the ORS and the numbers of PCOMS that your 5th grade child can understand. So it's a way to really look at your development as a therapist over time. And that's what we want to do, is foster continued professional reflection. So we encourage people to do 30 client blocks. That is, that when they close 30, they'll get a pretty good shot of how effective they are as a therapist. And we want them to keep their development front and center, for them to think about what they can do to improve their outcomes, learn new models, learn new techniques, work on their alliance skills, all these kinds of things. And then they can track it over time to see whether or not it's having an impact on their outcomes. Here you see in Better Outcomes Now, we track the last 30 for clinicians, last 50 for teams, last 100 for agencies, so you can use this as a quality improvement strategy to see if you're improving over time. Finally, the last part of the supervisory process is the mentoring process, and here's where the supervisor will not only talk about the stats, maybe do some active skill building, work on mining client teachings, or where therapists are doing things they've never done before and what they're learning from those experiences. A lot of therapist growth comes from that. And again, just fostering ongoing professional reflection about being a therapist and what that means. Those are the 4 steps. I invite you to give that some thought and check out the PCOMS readiness checklist on the training or implementation page on the website. And of course, that website is www.betteroutcomesnow.com. There are 250 free resources about PCOMS and improving your therapy via enhancing the common factors. And also don't forget about the new PCOMS manual, an integrated e-learning manual for everything PCOMS.